In the years following the Treaty of Versailles, the German Navy was a shadow of its former self, restricted to a small number of largely outdated warships. But after the Nazi seizure of power, ambitions for the new Kriegsmarine surface fleet were scaled up. To complement the Deutschland-class Panzerschiff commerce raiders, construction began on a pair of battle cruisers, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and battleships, Bismarck and Tirpitz. U-boat construction, by contrast, was given much lower billing, despite the success of submarines in World War I. Only a single new boat was constructed in 1937 and 6 in 1938. This was despite the Anglo-German naval agreement giving the Kriegsmarine the ability to build submarine tonnage equivalent to 45% of the British. This focus on the surface fleet was reinforced in 1938 with the formulation of Plan Z. Devised by Admiral Erich Raeder, the head of the Kriegsmarine, Plan Z was a fantasy wish list for a fleet that would recreate Germany's high seas fleet from World War I. It would comprise 10 battleships, 15 Panzerschiff commerce raiders, 65 cruisers, 8 aircraft carriers, and almost as an afterthought, 249 U-boats. Such a fleet was to be completed by 1948 and used to defeat Britain's navy. That the British might themselves build new ships of their own to match the Kriegsmarine, exactly as they had done the last time Germany embarked on a large building programme, does not seem to have been factored in. Raeder's focus on building a powerful surface fleet infuriated Captain Karl Dönitz, the head of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm. Believing that submarines would be the decisive weapon in the war at sea, Dönitz wanted a force of 300 U-boats constructed as an immediate priority, to suffocate Britain's trade routes in the event of war. But his requests fell on deaf ears, and Plan Z was adopted formally in January 1939 with its focus on capital ships first. It came with the added stipulation from Hitler that the plan had to be completed 3 years sooner than planned in 1945, a demand that was completely at odds with the reality of Germany's shipbuilding capacity. The very next month after approving Plan Z, Hitler tore the rug out from underneath it by abrogating the Anglo-German naval agreement in February 1939. Raeder was aghast. His nascent fleet was nowhere near ready to challenge the British Navy for control of the North Sea, let alone the Atlantic. As a result, almost as soon as war was declared a handful of months later in September, Plan Z had to be scrapped. The Kriegsmarine was left with a collection of decent but dramatically outnumbered surface ships, a very small U-boat arm, and no coherent strategy. In September 1939, Dönitz had no more than 46 U-boats, of which only 22 were suitable for service in the Atlantic. This meant that with regular maintenance periods factored in, only 7 could be deployed at any one time to Britain's key shipping routes. It was a very far cry from the armada of submarines Dönitz had asked for. Without it, he remarked that they would have to content ourselves with a series of pinpricks against British shipping, not a decisive blow. Luckily for Dönitz, if there was one other organisation in the world less well prepared to fight the Battle of the Atlantic, it was the Royal Navy. Despite the influential role that U-boats had played in the First World War, British policy in the interwar years was focused on limiting the capital ship construction of its rivals, in particular that of Japan. This was achieved by the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, which limited Japan to 35% of the Royal Navy's total tonnage. The Admiralty was less concerned with the potential threat posed by submarines. This was due to a measure of complacency after the comprehensive defeat of the U-boats in the First War, and a huge amount of faith being placed in the development of ASDIC sonar sets, which began to be fitted to British escort ships in 1932. It was hoped that with sonar and air cover from aircraft carriers, German U-boats could be aggressively hunted down and destroyed, which would save having to expend ships and men escorting thousands of merchant ships in convoy, as was done towards the end of World War I. Of much greater concern to the Admiralty were Germany's modern surface raiders, which it was feared would be able to strike with impunity throughout the Atlantic, being too fast to catch and too strong to destroy. Consequently, a huge number of ships were deployed to counter just 2 pocket battleships in the autumn of 1939. By the end of the year, both raiders had been cleared from the Atlantic and the Graf Spee sunk, with just 12 merchant ships sunk by their hand. A great success until you remember that 209 other merchant ships had also been sunk in the first 3 months of the war, 110 of which were lost to U-boat, the remainder being a combination of mines and the Luftwaffe. In addition to the strikes on merchant ships, the Royal Navy had also lost the aircraft carrier Courageous and battleship Royal Oak, both to U-boats. And this was at a time when the Kriegsmarine could only deploy a handful of submarines simultaneously. It's not hard to imagine the level of damage that could have been done had Barnett had even 100 U-boats in 1939, let alone the 300 he desired. Reluctantly, the British were forced to recognise that their strategy of offensive action was not working. Time and again, ships responding to distress calls would find nothing but wreckage. So, as in the First World War, the Admiralty began to implement organised convoys, where merchant shipping would be accompanied by escorts capable of driving off any lurking submarines. The only problem was that the Royal Navy didn't have nearly enough escorts for the job. In 1917, at the height of the U-boat threat in the First World War, the Royal Navy had maintained 449 vessels for convoy escort in home waters. By 1940, this number had fallen to 135. This meant that convoys would have to sail with inadequate escorts and be vulnerable to attacks by multiple U-boats. Despite this clear British vulnerability, the Germans were slow to properly buy into making U-boat construction a priority. Hitler still dreamed of a powerful surface fleet with the under construction Bismarck and Tirpitz at its centre. The Kriegsmarine did present a plan in October 1939 to ramp up submarine production to 28 boats a month, but this did not come to fruition. You see, such an increase in the U-boat force would inevitably deprive other parts of the German armed forces, like the Luftwaffe, of resources it needed to meet its own production plans, and Reichsmarschall Göring managed to lobby Hitler successfully to protect his own force's resources. What resulted was the formal adoption of Raiders' proposals, but without the resources to make it a reality. Instead of 28 boats a month, in the first 6 months of 1940 the Germans managed barely 2, only enough to replenish their losses. Opportunities to bring more firepower on Allied shipping were missed. By contrast, the British recognised the threat that U-boats posed and acted quickly to deal with their lack of escorts. In the 1940 programme, 120 corvettes and 80 new destroyers were ordered, and 50 old destroyers obtained from the United States as part of the Destroyers for Bases agreement. Once merchantmen were in convoy with better escorts, the U-boats found it much harder to sink them, even as they ran riot amongst those ships still travelling unescorted. Of 992 ships sunk globally in 1940, only 101 were in convoy on the main route in and out of the British Isles. This was 101 sunk out of 17,882 merchant ships that made the journey that year, a loss rate of just 0.6%. Both the Royal Navy and Kriegsmarine planned for the wrong kind of war at sea. Both navies seemed to think the heavy lifting would be done by surface ships, a cat-and-mouse game between powerful German surface raiders and the Allied navies. But this wasn't the case. The British overestimated the effectiveness of early war sonar, and the Germans overestimated the utility of their pocket battleship raiders. Just as Barnett had been arguing, the U-boats were by far the Kriegsmarine's most effective weapon, while the surface fleet struggled really to make an impact in the Atlantic. Plan Z, for all its grand visions, was really a plan at odds with reality. The British still had a superior shipbuilding industry and would never have allowed the Kriegsmarine to match them in capital ships. Likewise, the Royal Navy's focus on maintaining a strong battle fleet in the interwar years had left it with more than a dozen mostly aging battleships and not nearly enough escort ships to counter even the handful of U-boats that Barnett was deploying in 1939. But they soon realised their mistake and pushed escorts to the very top of production priorities, whereas the Germans hesitated, continuing their pre-war habit of making decisions that were chaotic, confused and sometimes outright contradictory. And it's a good job they did, because the damage that a fleet of the kind Admiral Barnett wanted could have done might have changed the entire course of the war before it had really even begun.